This is the show that helps you know what to quit, what to keep, and what to question. Welcome to the QuitCast. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the QuitCast. My name is Becca, and I'm your host today. We are talking about context, which is one of the 34 Clifton strengths, where we look at the themes of how you might be wired to be strong and how that will apply to your writing if you're a writer. And so we're going to talk to Terry and Becca first about how context looks. How does it show up? What does it look like? And then we'll talk to three amazing writers about how context looks for them in their successful careers. And so first of all, take it away, Terry and Becca.
So when I think of context, because Crystal, my co-writer, is high in context, I always think of how she starts her books. She starts her books with so much backstory, and she has been told to take it out, of course, so she's really self-conscious about it. And what we learned about her is if she just puts it in, like just write the context, write the backstory, because as a context, she needs to understand the character from so many different perspectives before she can write them well and effectively. And she even says sometimes, and I think this is common for a lot of high context writers, that she has to write a character for so long before she knows them, because she needs to understand like what's behind them, what's their backstory, where did they come from, who are they. And it's not always, and this is what's super important to me, it's not always stuff she can just make up. Like she can't just sit down with a worksheet and be like, right, here's 14 things that I made up about this person. It's a little bit more like their actions reveal something about them, and then from those actions you learn something about their backstory, and then from that backstory it causes you to understand how they move forward, and then that helps you learn a little bit more about them, right? So it's this constant retrospect of like, what you did shows me who you were, and who you were shows me what you'll do. Does that make sense?
It does. It totally makes sense that context, because context sees that bigger picture and the wider, the history of things. And you might see when you're writing a story at a certain point, but definitely for context, they want to know what happened before that. And they may not be able to know that without getting deep into it and following that story a little long. So what you said makes perfect sense for someone.
Right. Because they're looking for patterns, right? Like, I think that's the piece of the moving forward and then looking backwards, and then looking forward and going backwards, and looking forward and going backwards. That's almost like you're building their history as you write. And I think a lot of high context writers feel like it's not okay for them to do things like go and do a bunch of research, because quote unquote, nobody does that. Like if you really, and this is one of the big strengths where we get the whole just stop thinking and start writing, right? Or just stop researching and start writing. And context people can really push against that intuitively, because they know that how they create characters, they need that stuff.
Right. And I've found, and I've heard that context people seem to have, even when they recall their own memories or history that they're interested in, they seem to have a deeper, richer reconstruction ability to reconstruct it than normal people do as well. And I would guess that comes, well, I know it comes through in their storytelling as well, that they can make it more real because that's where they're living. The past is more real to them, right? More concrete. And so that ability is another, I think, a great ability that context people have as storytellers, is the ability to transport us back there, make us see it, feel it, taste it, because to them, that's where they are. They're literally there, which is very fascinating.
Well, and how they understand the future is based in how they understand what happened before. How they understand the present is based in how they understand what happened before. And I think a lot of people say things like, well, but I like history, or I think of those things. And I'm like, but it's different, because if you ask a context person, their very first instinct is the past. Like we always sort of joke when you ask someone, what do you love about writing? And they go back to when they were 3 years old, and they start telling us the story, from because who they were makes them who they are on such a profound level. And there's this like almost a disconnection with a lot of people who don't have context from their past, not intentionally, but it's like I answer your question, just the question you gave me. So the pushback that context people get in conversation a lot is that they want to go backwards to help people understand how we got there, and not everybody finds that to be helpful. So then they get this barrier label, right, of like, oh my gosh, you tell us all this unnecessary stuff all the time, but to a context person it's totally necessary for them.
And I think that, like you just said it there clearly, we think of them as going back, but I think context people often think of themselves as not going back at all, but still being there, that they're
Right.
describing the room as it is presently. It's almost like they're there, and so they can
Like it's
describe it
present,
better and see it. Yeah. And so
like the
I know I've
history is
talked.
present with them,
Right.
right?
Yeah. I've heard context people talk, they don't talk like I'm adaptable. I live in the present. You're futuristic. You live in the future. We go back, but to a context person, and you get that, what you described of them talking about when they were younger and always been writers and always want to do this. It doesn't feel like they're recounting something. It sounds like they're telling you something in the first person present for them, which is kind of
Right. Like
interesting.
why
Yeah.
you
Very
asked
interesting
why,
to experience.
right? And then
Yeah.
I say, basically, like if you were to encapsulate what they said, it would be I've always been like this, and everything in my life has shaped me to come to this place. And then they show you how that's happened.
Yeah.
And I feel like too, and this happened on the author talk show, which was really interesting. One of the authors made a comment that when I sent them the request to be on the show, they were like, you're going to have to tell me more about what you're expecting, what do you want, like, show me all the questions, show me, all of these things. Like the things that she needed to know were so much more robust than, like, I basically just sent them an email and said, hey, do you want to do this author interview with me? And the context people were like, I need to know more. I need to understand why you want me to do this. What role would I play? What's my expertise? And it was so fascinating because I'm like, even just in little tiny things, the context presents itself, which is really cool to see, because that means like it's deep in your being at that point.
So when it's behaving healthy, a healthy context will say that's how that's part of their process, right? Instead of complaining about it, that it takes too long or that they go too deep, that is their process.
Right. It's what they need. Like
Yeah.
when we talk to context people who are in like a corporate environment, for instance, they often get a lot of pushback for asking too many questions. And it's but I need to understand, like the context person would say, but I need to understand exactly why we're doing this, where we're headed. I need to know all of these different details so we make sure we don't miss anything or do anything wrong. Or so we make sure to honor, like, has this been done before better in the past? I'll never forget being in a company where they had a brand new boss who had come in, who came from a lateral, like it was a lateral pay move, but it was a different industry. And when she came in, she was like, oh, we're going to try this new thing. And she was getting all excited about this super innovative idea that she'd come up with. And essentially, somebody was like, yeah, we've done that. We've been doing that for 10 years. We just call it something different. And if the context person hadn't spoken up, they would have just moved forward with this activator ideation thing that literally they had been doing, but no one wanted to argue with the new boss, right? Because it's like, ooh, don't speak up and say anything. But the context person then said, well, here's what we've been doing. Here's how this has been going. And they gave a lot more information. And you could tell in the meeting that everybody was really uncomfortable, because it was this, like, you could instinctively sense that the boss wanted to just move forward and forget about it and dismiss the history. But it turned out that by honoring what they had done in the past and then tweaking those things, they actually had a better program, instead of just completely starting from scratch and not utilizing all this institutional memory that they had. So context does get a bad rap in corporations a lot, because it's messy. Stopping and asking questions and having to understand context is messy. It's not efficient and fast the way that I think some people who are not high in context want it to be, but it's so beneficial. And I think we don't honor enough how much we need to understand what came before us in order to move forward. And context definitely does that for us.
So let's start out with our fabulous context authors.
I am Mandy Roth. I write pretty much almost anything romance, predominantly paranormal, paranormal women's fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, those types of things. My context, just depending on which test you go off of, I took one and then about a year later I took another, relatively high. I believe it's either 1 or 2 depending on which test you go off of. So.
I'm Tara Pammi. I write contemporary romance mostly for now, and my context is 5.
I'm Simone, and I write erotic romance, both contemporary and historical, and I am a number 1 context.
And I always think of context as being the strength where you get to know all of the things about something, right? And where all of the things that you can know about something impacts the way that you understand the thing. Mm-hmm. So the metaphor that we always use is you are standing in the middle of a room that's dark and you're trying to understand what the room looks like around you and what room you're in. And in order to do that, the context is turning on lights at 5-degree intervals, trying to understand like the shadows and where they play and how much information you need to know before you actually know like, oh, we're in a square room or we're in a triangular room or whatever is different. Like it's not that you need 180 or 360 degrees of light necessarily. It's once you can understand how the patterns work and how the light plays off and you see kind of all the corners of the room, then you can make the decision about, oh, this is where we are and this is how that works. So that's kind of like the core of context. But if you were to describe context to someone who hadn't heard of it before, like how do you understand context to work? And Sierra, let's start with you.
Well, I used to be a librarian in a public library, and so for me, my brain is laid out a lot like the stacks in like the nonfiction section, where one resource is never in isolation. The resource is always next to other resources, some of whom came before it, some of whom challenge that perspective or complicate that perspective. And so everything is always kind of in relation to like, not just things directly related to it, but also like surrounding adjacent ideas. And so that's kind of how I see the strength as being able to sort of map out that like adjacency and complication and depth, I guess, in an idea as well.
Yeah, that's so accurate. Tara, how about you? How does context make sense to you?
So first, I wanted to mention something earlier. So when you had asked me, do you want to take part in the context conversation? And my immediate response was, can you just give me more time to gather more context before? I don't think I have quite the whole entire picture, that context to add out. But anyway, so that was funny.
I love that. That's the most context question ever, by the way.
I feel like it's context humor. We're all like, no, we're kidding.
Yeah. I love that.
So for me, it's actually pretty similar to what Sierra said. It's like being asked one question for me, and even the simplest question from one of my girls never results in, I like this because it's always, so let me tell you, like this happened, right? And then this happened. And then all these things came together. And so there's never a simple answer to any question. There's so much background, there's so much past and present. That's how I see context in everyday life for me. Like, not like, even I think it also helps me be very good with listening to people, because I'm trying to first understand, like, okay, what is the situation here, what happened, who said what. So I see context like that in everything and every day.
Yeah, I love that. That's so accurate. Mandy, what about you?
I like to tell people that I have to know everything about everything about everything. So any detail I need to know, then the spin-off detail, and I need to know so much to use so little in the book. Does that make sense? Like I jump into this big vat of knowledge and I pull out little tiny thread bits that may or may not be used in the end of it, but the amount of time, energy, and research and everything that I put into knowing all of that could in itself fill like a whole series of books, but I use it in maybe a paragraph here and there. So I like to also say this makes me fun at trivia.
Yes.
Yeah. I know a lot of answers to a lot of random things. So.
Yes. What's so funny about that too is that I can imagine all these context writers listening to this video and saying something similar to, well, but I don't need that much information, right? Like because we hear this a lot with like a maximizer who's like, yeah, I don't care about excellence that much. And I'm like, oh no, but your standard is so much higher than people who don't have that strength. So like when Crystal, for instance, my co-writer is at High Context, and she's always like, yeah, but I don't do that much research before I start. And I'm like, yeah, you do. Like, you don't think you do because you're not like, I don't need to read 45 books on something. But it's like, before you can even understand who the character is, you have to know the answers to all of these questions. Even if you write your way into that, because that's kind of how she does it, right? Like, she writes her way into understanding the context. But she doesn't really know who the character is until like chapter 14, like 13 or 14 of the book, because she's still trying to figure out who they are by all of the things that you understand about them to be true, right? So I think a context writer who says, oh, but I don't do that, I would like say, look at me in the eyes, like, yeah, you do. You just have a higher threshold of like how much you need to know. And you know other people who need to know more than you. And so it's like, oh, but I don't need to know that much, because we need to normalize. I feel like we need to normalize needing context in order to make decisions, right?
Right.
Yeah. Like, if you had discovered something like with Tara talking about wanting to know more context, it's like, if you had discovered something that wouldn't work for your schedule, like let's say we need to have this recorded tomorrow or something, right? Like, or I need you to be an expert who can talk on your own about context without me directing you, then you would have said no, because you don't feel like you're in that place. So for me, asking for context it's like, it's normal, but I guess like I normalize it because context is so important. But yeah. And I love that you each gave different answers as well. Like, that's what's so cool to me about how the strengths work, is that every writer understands the strength in their own context as well. And that changes the way that the strength can work or how it manifests. So I think that's really exciting as well. In your writing process, how does context manifest for you?
Well, before you, I didn't understand it was manifesting for me. I just thought, gosh darn it, here I am stuck because I'm trying to fit the mold of what so many of my author friends do, which is just write it and then they go look up a little detail if they need it. And they write that little detail in, but I could not move forward in the process. I just kept hitting this invisible wall. And they would look at me and go, why do you do this? Why do you go take all these extra courses? Why do you spend all this extra money? Why do you go buy 47 extra reference books that you're going to open one time? And that's just a waste of your time. That's a waste of your money. And for me, it always felt like a weird security blanket. And then everyone kept telling me it was wrong. So then I jumped on board to be like, okay, what's wrong? I'm going to try to streamline. I bet I could work a lot faster if I did that, right? No, it turns out I don't work at all. So until I didn't even realize it was my process. Right. Now I'm just like, give me all the data. Just give me, I'm going to roll in it. Right. What sticks is what's going in. But I feel my way during it. I don't ever know what I'm going to use and what I don't. I just feel it out. And then it just, to me, it seems magical, but as you've pointed out a number of times, no, I've already been setting that up, but I just don't realize it. So,
yeah. Well, and what's so cool in watching your process is that, like, if you imagine that a character has a particular job, like, part of the way that you understand him or her is by going and looking at what they do and how that shapes them, and what the expectations of that job are, and what kind of life experience they might have along the way. And all of those little details show up somehow. Like, even if you don't include all the details, right? Like, everything shapes them into being a slightly different person, which is so cool to watch about your process. Like, you know, taking the equivalency of like college degree courses to try to understand genetics or nuclear physics or something, because it helps you to get inside that character's head to know all of that context. Like, that's amazing to me. I love it. Yeah. The iceberg. That's how I think of Mandy's books. It's like there's an iceberg underneath the water of all the stuff that she learned that holds up the stuff that ends up in the book. But all the stuff under the water is still necessary to like hold up that little part.
I'm just going to let you laugh at me. So what I'm working on now.
Yeah. Yay. Yeah. That's so exciting to me. I love it so much. And you're also top 5 input as well, right? Yeah.
And focus. So,
yeah.
So I'm just like, oh, gotta know it all. Just nobody interrupt. Squirrel. Okay, I'm done. No.
Yeah. I love that. Tara, what about you? How do you see context appearing in your writing process?
So for me, like Mandy said, it's interesting how you hear the similarities and you go, oh, I do that too. So for me, it's pretty much characters. I think my characters are so 3-dimensional, and they refuse to form. Like those character questionnaire things, they never work for me, because it's just, I'm like, what does favorite color have to do with anything, right? For me, I have to see the past shaping them, like what happened the year before or even the end. It's really interesting because I always find it very funny to see characters in a romance, for example, who like how we want to pretend that they don't have a past love life sometimes. But I'm like, how is that possible? If they didn't at all have a past love life, that is saying such a huge thing. And, everybody they dated, for example, or everybody they broke up with, who they are, like right now, is shaped by everything they have done to that day, that minute. And for me, as I'm writing, that's a picture that my brain literally holds up constantly. So I think I do character arcs also really well, because for me, I can just, it has to move constantly. Like, I think I find scenes like fun and games, I find them very hard to write after a little while, because it just feels like, okay, like it's constant. There is no movement backward or forward. So that's how I see text in my writing.
Yeah. And I feel like with you specifically, like you're watching for those patterns that tell you something about them. Right. And I think that's because I remember there was a book you were working on where it was like, there was a detail about this character that didn't really fit and make sense. And it was like, it hadn't locked in yet, right? And then when you figured that out, it was like, oh, now I get her and why she did this and why this happened. And then it was like the story kind of locked in for you. And so I feel like there's this also piece of who they are tells you something about them.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, like changing someone's backstory, like an editor who says, go pull out this character or like whatever. And then you're like, oh, that just changed.
But
like
for me,
who they are.
They're just a new character. It's not just a change in some small detail. No, they're a different character now for me.
Yeah.
And how they approach love and everything changes then.
Yeah, like I always say, if you're a writer like this, you should rename the character when you do that. Like if you ever end up having to totally change somebody and it doesn't feel like they're the right person, if you rename them, sometimes it helps you to be like, okay, that was Joe and this is Ben, right? And so now I'm going to write Ben as though he exists like this, so I don't keep glitching with this old character.
Now you don't have 2 giant databases, they
right.
just separate
internally.
Instead of tagging, you immediately make 2 different instances. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And and we'll talk about this a little when we get into the business and marketing, but I think too, with Tara, the conversation we had about her context that I think was so cool was watching how much information a context needs to have before they can make a pattern assumption, right? And with this particular, it was about a writing process, but it was how her intellection works, right? And not being able to see, like, you don't have to fix that intellection part until you could see it iterate several times.
Mhm.
And it was almost like it didn't really click in until you had enough context that your context would recognize the patterns, right?
Mhm.
Because that's what context is doing. It's looking for what is the repetition and what does that repetition say about me or the character or whatever. So that was really cool to watch as well. Sierra, what about you? How do you see context in your writing?
Well, I'm learning a lot about myself as I'm listening to Mandy and Tara, because it had actually not occurred to me until just this moment that the reason while I'm drafting, I can't just say, come back and answer this question, or come back and plug in this detail later, and then keep going. Like, if I don't know even a, inconsequential detail, like right now I'm writing a book about a monk. Like, if I don't know the color of his robe, then like I genuinely can't move forward in the scene. And I thought that it was because I am like, I don't know, that I have some sort of pathological problem that I'm actually appreciating now, that it's just my context at work that really needs to populate this world as richly as possible as I'm moving through it. Because, it's like Tara was saying, it's like every scene a character moves through is changing them. They're a different person from scene to scene. And so I need to know everything about that scene because they're going to come out the other side a little bit different. And if I don't know what's changing them, then I don't know how they're going to be different. So thank you guys for helping me solve that riddle. For me, I really find that I'm drawn to stories or premises or themes that have sort of an existing tradition behind them. So I have a series that's like a King Arthur retelling. And so in a way, that's me sort of going back to this beautiful pool of legends and mythologies and kind of, sort of bathing around in it and deciding what I want to bring with me into my new iteration. Or I tell stories that involve the Catholic Church in some way. And so I'm really drawing on a lot of ancient Catholic traditions that were really important to me when I was a young person, and bringing them into my writing. And so I really love engaging with these things that have these sort of deep cultural imprints, and then being able to sort of bring it out and kind of put my own spin on it.
Yeah, I see that. Like, it feels to me like there's a depth to everything that happens, right? Like almost like there's a history to every action. And in your book specifically, I think because you do rely on history, literally, but they're contemporary, right? Like they're contemporary stories, but they rely on history. Like I see your context so much in something like, well, and let's just take the color of the robe as an example. Like if you know anything about Catholic tradition, you know that like it's possible that a robe could mean something. Like it's possible that the type of robe or the style they wear or the color could actually be meaningful to the history of that order or to a change in the order or something like that. And as a context, if that detail is telling, like if it says something about that character, you want that to be right before you can move forward with that story. Because if it changed something, it'd be like Tara said, like we were talking with Tara about taking a family member away, right? Like that makes the whole person a different person. If they grew up without a brother or with a brother, if they grew up in one order versus another order, like that makes them a different person. And so context writers, I think, understand that in a way that I'm not sure other people would catch the nuance quite as much, right? Like maybe an intellection, maybe a connectedness or an individualization, but it just wouldn't be quite the same. So I definitely see that. Yeah, I feel history when I read your books, even though they're very contemporary, right?
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
What Zira mentioned, I have that pull towards historical figures, institutions. So I was raised a Hindu. I'm like, I don't know if I am now or not, but there's so much mythology, and I see people who either like are conforming to it without questions, or people who walk away from it, and I'm like, no, wait, like this either approach is not the answer, and I want to constantly address it and mine it for things that can be like ejected, and then put forward like this new interpretation. So I totally feel that pull towards those historically like upheld either figures or institutions, or so that's really interesting.
Same.
Yeah, because the history tells us something, right? Like how people replicate patterns tells you something as a high context. And I think that kind of storytelling capacity is unique. And I will say, like each one of your books, to me, if you're a high context person, and this is why I picked the three of you specifically, you need to go and read their books if you're context, because you'll see that the patterning in how they create characters, the patterning in how they use information. It's a standout capacity. This is why I love strengths. It's a way for you as a writer to take advantage of something that you love, and maximize that so that when the readers experience it, they get to feel that part of you that loves that. And that's what they love, right? Is they love that connection. And so that's just like a cheerleader moment that I always feel like I have to have with context, because, and Mandy kind of brought this up. When people don't have high context, they often don't understand why you would like steep your mythology or your history into your contemporary books, for instance, or your contemporary characters. Like we want to cut people off from today, from history, so that they're just today and only today. But there are so many readers that appreciate that level of detail and that level of character development, that I think utilizing that makes you a memorable writer if you're a person who does that. And so, like in an industry where you have to stand out for something, like you have to be memorable for something, that's kind of an easy place for me if you're a high context person. And so, because I would imagine each of you would also like each other's books. Like that would be my guess.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do as soon as we talk.
Yeah. Like I would be willing to bet that you would, because I really see context so heavily in each of your narrative styles. And I don't know if everybody can see it or if it's just me because I'm on the lookout for it. But now I'm super interested to hear what you guys have to say about it. I'm just interested to know if you feel like, do you utilize context in the way that you market your books or the way that you run your business?
That's very interesting, because for me, in terms of marketing, after like the book is done, I feel like context kind of takes me out at the knee, because every time I'm starting, I feel like I have to set the context and tell people first, like, look, I am this person who writes this books because this is, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like even a simple Instagram post can be like, hey, look, I love this flower, right? Like, and I wrote this flower into this book because it's my favorite. No, the flower has a significance. The book has a significance. So I still, like you said, I still haven't figured out quite how to bake that into it. But in terms of business, like a top view, I've only started doing this since the last year. Once I started working with Becca, I think my context is really helping me see how each book I put out kind of fits into the bigger picture of who I want to be as a writer going forward. Like I didn't do this before, but now I'm kind of baking that into the book, even at the planning time, because I think I want to build that bigger cohesive picture from the beginning. Like, so when the book is done and I'm thinking, how do I market it, I have it, it serves this purpose in my big picture of who I want to be as a writer or as an author. So I think I'm realizing that context is what is helping me there. Like, I'm kind of sometimes frustrated because I'm like, okay, just go ahead and write it, but I'm giving myself grace to wait and do that work up front rather than at the back end, and then thinking, okay, wait, how do I put this book forward for my readers in my catalog? Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. And I love that, because I do think that readers think that way without realizing it. Like, readers categorize us as writers. If they're talking about Tara's books or Mandy's books or Sierra's books, they talk about us by the things that are memorable for them and how the books fit in with their understanding. So like, they naturally do that, right? So everything that we do to help them know how to talk about us, I think is helpful for them as well. Yeah, I completely see that. Yeah. Mandy, what about you? How do you see context in your marketing?
Well, interestingly enough, I started in marketing before I was an author. And I think looking back now, that my marketing approach was very context, and I didn't realize what that was then. But I need and still need to know everything about everything. So everything in the genre, everything that's in a related genre, anything that's, that I'm dealing with marketing, I want to know everything about it, from the color schemes that resonate in it to keywords and buzzwords that are really kind of specific to that, to how to give that nugget or tidbit of information to the reader and pass it on. So I'm not overwhelming them in the marketing, but I'm kind of drawing them in and exciting them. Like I had a newsletter that just went out about Russian brown bears, because I have a brown bear shifter from Russia. And it's just kind of giving the readers a little bit of a tidbit, a little tips and whatever about, how many are over there, what's the most popular, how big they are, what they like to eat. Just a little glimpse into all the stuff that I learned that they may not even see in a book, but just a little behind the scenes to get them excited about his book. So I do things like that. I've been very careful with his marketing to keep it in a lot of reds because of Russia, and a lot of yellows, and a lot of things that I may not actually spell out for them, but things that I do that are all involved in having learned everything I could about that before I put it in front of them. So
I love that so much too, because I see that now watching your marketing. Like, I watch your Instagram and I'm like, ooh, this is about Rourke's book, right? Yeah. Because I know the visual cues now, and because I've talked to Mandy about she's teaching me how to learn TikTok, right? And so she's been kind of helping me understand the culture of TikTok, which, as a marketer, like somebody who's really into marketing, talking to a context strategic about marketing is so much fun, because they just understand things from such a big picture level. And I'm such a why asker, right? So like, talking to the context strategic has been really cool. I feel like you understand the culture of something in addition to understanding like the actual logistics or something of a particular, let's say, like even just a platform. So like, I very much see that context in your marketing approach for sure, and how you help other authors all the time too.
I love helping her, which I always like weird people out. I'm like totally in your. So if I start just reaching out going, hey, do you need any help with your thing? It's not me being weird. It's just what I do.
Yeah. Yeah. She literally will send me, and she'll be like, you should do this on TikTok. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm totally going to do that on TikTok. Like, I love it so much. Sierra, what about you? How do you see context in your marketing?
Well, a couple ways. So one thing I realized is similar to how Tara was talking about, how does a book fit into kind of your larger brand? And that is something that I use in marketing, that like the answer to that question in terms of like, did you like Priest, but you wanted queer characters? Did you like Curvy Girl, but you wanted there to be Christmas trees? Like, here's this book that kind of like, it shows me sort of iterating on the ideas and themes that are already sort of housed under my brand. Because I think of myself as like, this sort of tree in the forest, right? And there's all these other trees that are doing all these really great things. And so I'm not really trying to crowd out the other trees with my branches. I'm trying to grow my roots deeper and really anchor myself into my patch of the forest. And so when I market, that's what I'm really trying to do. Is I want Sierra's books to have a certain feeling to them. So how can I market that feeling? But I also try when I'm putting together a marketing plan, that's not my strength. I'm just going to put it out there. Like, I'm not great at marketing, but I have found it's a lot easier for me to make a plan that I can have context inside of the plan with. So instead of saying, I'm just going to do a bunch of Instagram posts, for me, it's easier to say, okay, I'm going to do a series of Instagram posts that are highlighting these certain things about the books. Or like for Thorn Chapel, I commissioned some cocktail recipes that go with each book. So then I was able to sort of theme these posts around this idea of cocktail recipes for the books. And so just having like the context of a marketing plan and what I want to feature and what big ideas I want to implement really helps, because I'm not a spontaneous marketer. Like, I'm not the kind of person who can just sit down and be like, oh, I'm going to throw up a teaser post, or I'm going to make something in Canva real fast, to put on Instagram. Like, I really need to have that sort of bigger, like, picture, I guess, moving in. And the other thing that I found really works well for me is sort of like intra book context, where I'm kind of going back to the beginning of why I was inspired to write that book and using that in the marketing. So like if I had made a mood board, or if there had been a song that had really, gotten to me, or if I saw a TV show where Gillian Anderson wears a silk blouse and I just had to write a book about it. Like, those are the kind of details that I can really use and leverage in marketing. I think everyone kind of knows the story of Stephenie Meyer and Twilight. Like, everyone knows how Twilight was inspired. It was a dream, right? She had this dream about a vampire and a girl sitting together in the forest. And I think the reason that story, really caught everyone's interest is that there's something really compelling about that raw flash of potential, that raw flash of inspiration that sets us on the journey to writing a book. And it's so compelling that it speaks even to readers who are not writers. And so I try to kind of go back to the beginning of like what I loved about this project, what drove me to write it, and then use those in my marketing as well.
One of the things I love about strengths and how they apply to our writing is that when those patterns are so ingrained in us, we often act in them without even realizing that we do. And the great thing about watching successful writers who have that strength is we know when those behaviors are happening, especially the ones that are often like, don't do this, from experts, right? We hear that all the time. We know, but you can still be successful and do those things. So I think it's really important to have some of those behaviors normalized for us. And that's one of the biggest reasons that we do so much work with strengths. So I'm really thankful that all of those context writers were with us this week and that they said things exactly the way they said them, because some of us have thought those things in our head before and have wondered, like, why aren't more people like this? I don't understand. So the reason why is because there are different brain patterns in your head than in the heads of other people. So when those patterns are different, they produce different effects. And it's really important to know that there is no such thing as best practice. It literally does not exist. Best practice is different for all of us. So what is best practice for context writer? Well, you just saw it today. And thank you so much to everyone for contributing to this episode. I'm so excited that you got to hear from these context writers. We have more Strengths for Writers episodes coming up. Of course, we still have about 10 left to get through, and my hope is that we'll get through them before this summer. If you haven't joined us yet on our Patreon, where we talk about all things writing and how to get better faster and how to get better and all of those things, author success alignment is the whole point of our Patreon. So please come and join us. We have topical calls where we do group coaching. We talk about fictional characters. Sometimes we talk about all kinds of things. So I hope that you'll join us on our Patreon. It was so good to have you here today. And I hope that you will join us next week again on the QuickCast. Bye, everybody.